I don't know if I should be telling anyone this story, but I have reached a point where keeping silent has become impossible, where the weight of what I know and what I have experienced has become too heavy to carry alone any longer. And I realized that speaking it aloud, putting it into words, committing it to a record that might outlive me, is the only way I can hope to find any kind of peace or redemption. Though I suspect that neither of those things are possible for someone who has done what I have done, someone who has failed so catastrophically in their duty to care for a vulnerable human being, and then spend years running from that failure instead of facing it directly. And so I am going to tell you everything from the very beginning, from before the night that changed everything, because you need to understand the full context, the complete picture, in order to make sense of what happened and why it happened and what it means. And I am going to trust that you will listen with an open mind, even though what I am about to describe will sound impossible, will sound like the fever dream of a mind that has been broken by guilt and grief and the slow erosion of the human soul that comes from working too long in a profession where you see too much death and suffering and are powerless to prevent most of it. My name is Dr. Arjun Malhotra. I am now 54 years old, and I have been a physician for 27 years, ever since I graduated from medical school in 1998 with top honors and a heart full of idealism about the power of medicine to heal and the ability of science to save lives, and the notion that if you worked hard enough and cared deeply enough and paid close attention to your patients, then you could make a difference in the world. And for the first 15 years of my career, I truly believed that. I believed it with an almost religious conviction. I believed it more than I believed in anything else, more than I believed in God or in love or in the goodness of humanity, because medicine seemed like the one pure thing in a corrupt world, the one avenue through which a person could do genuine good, could actually make a measurable difference in someone's life. And I threw myself into that work with complete dedication, sacrificing time with my family, sacrificing my marriage, sacrificing my health, all of it on the altar of what I believed was a noble calling. And for a while, it sustained me. The knowledge that I was helping people, that I was saving lives, that I was making a difference in the community. But somewhere along the way, something shifted, something cracked in my faith, and I started to see the cracks in the system. The ways in which medicine was not about healing, but about profit. The ways in which patients were treated as billable units rather than as human beings. The ways in which doctors like me were overworked and underpaid and burnt out and ground down by bureaucratic nonsense until we became shells of the idealistic people we had once been. And by the time I reached my late 40s, I was a ghost of a man, a doctor in name only, going through the motions, collecting a paycheck, counting down the days until retirement, and St. Agnes Hospital, where I had worked since 2006, had become less of a place, where I helped people and more of a prison, where I served out a sentence for crimes I could not quite articulate. And that was the state I was in on the night of March 14th, 2017. A broken man, a burnt-out doctor, a hollow shell of someone who had once believed he could change the world. I had been born in 1970 in a small city in India, in a family that valued education above all else. My father was an engineer, educated and respected in our community. My mother was a school teacher, brilliant and kind, and they both believed that the greatest gift they could give their children was knowledge, was the power that came from understanding how the world worked. And when I was 12 years old, they made the difficult decision to immigrate to the United States, leaving behind extended family and a secure position and everything they knew, in order to give my sister and me better educational opportunities. And we settled in a middle-class suburb of a major American city. And I grew up speaking two languages, straddling cultures, belonging completely to neither. And I think that sense of not quite belonging anywhere is what drove me into medicine. The sense that if I could be exceptionally good at something, if I could be recognized and respected and successful in some measurable way, then maybe I would finally feel like I belonged somewhere. And medicine was the perfect vehicle for that. Because it was quantifiable. Because you could measure success in terms of patients treated and lives saved and articles published and positions gained. And because it was also noble. Because it allowed me to tell myself and everyone else that I was doing it all for good reasons. Not for personal advancement, but to help humanity. And so I worked obsessively through high school and college and medical school, taking every opportunity to distinguish myself, publishing research papers, winning awards, earning degrees, accumulating credentials like a miser, accumulating gold. And by the time I graduated from medical school in 1998, I had become the person I thought I wanted to be. I had achieved the success I thought would bring me happiness and fulfillment and a sense of belonging. And yet, the moment I graduated, the moment I achieved that goal, I felt an emptiness settle over me that no amount of professional success could ever feel. And I have spent the last 27 years trying to fill that emptiness with work, with achievement, with the endless pursuit of something that I cannot quite name and that I suspect does not exist. And by the time I was working night shifts at Agnes Hospital in 2017, that emptiness had calcified into something harder and colder and darker, into a kind of fundamental despair about the nature of existence, the futility of human effort, and the inevitable failure of any attempt to impose order or meaning on a fundamentally chaotic and meaningless universe. St. Agnes Hospital itself has a history that is deeply troubling, though I did not understand the full extent of that history until after the events I'm describing. The building that now houses St. Agnes was constructed in 1952 on the site of an older psychiatric facility, an asylum that had been built in 1889, and that had served as a holding place for people with severe mental illness during an era when the treatment of such people was primitive and cruel and often more akin to imprisonment than to medical care. That older building, which was called the Riverside Psychiatric Facility, burned down on March 15th, 1949, in a fire that officially was ruled accidental, but that was surrounded by whispers and rumors of something darker, something more deliberate. The fire killed 317 people, mostly patients, many of them trapped in locked wards on the upper floors. And the investigation concluded that the fire had been started by a cigarette left burning in one of the men's dormitories. But there were stories told by night shift workers and orderlies and people who had worked there. Stories of screaming that seemed coordinated to be random panic. Stories of a patient named Samuel Wickham, who had been known to make threats, who had spoken frequently of burning the place down and freeing everyone inside. Stories of the fire starting not in one place but in multiple places simultaneously. Stories that suggested not an accident but an act of deliberate destruction. And whether those stories were true or false, I cannot say. But what is true is that the hospital administration decided to build a new facility on the same site, as if building a newer, more modern hospital would somehow cleanse the location of its history. And the new St. Agnes Hospital opened in 1952 with much fanfare and optimism, and for many years it operated normally. It was considered a well-run facility with high patient satisfaction and good outcomes. And then gradually, over the course of decades, strange things began to be reported by the staff who worked the night shift. mostly by doctors and nurses who spent the deep hours of the night in the building. Things that they did not report officially because they knew how they would sound, how they would be dismissed as the ravings of tired minds or the paranoia of people who had spent too long in a building after dark. But the stories persisted, and over the years, I heard some of them. Heard them from nurses who were retiring and who figured they had nothing left to lose by speaking the truth. Heard them from orderlies who had worked in the basement and claimed to have heard voices in the walls. Heard them from doctors who had taken leaves of absence for undefined mental health reasons and had never returned. And I filed all of these stories away in the back of my mind as the kinds of urban legends that accumulate around any large institution. The stories that paranoid people tell to explain away the natural anxieties and discomforts of working in a hospital, which is after all a place associated with sickness and death and suffering, where it is natural for people to feel unsettled and afraid. And I did not really believe in any of them, or at least I told myself I did not believe in them until I experienced something that forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality and consciousness and the boundaries between the living world and whatever might exist beyond it. March 14th, 2017. Started out like any other night shift. I arrived at the hospital at 6 p.m., did my routine handoff meeting with the day shift doctor, reviewed the charts of patients currently in the hospital, made my rounds to check on them personally, noted any medications that needed to be administered or dosages that needed to be adjusted. And by midnight, I was settled in the duty room with my tea and my files. The pediatric ward on the 3rd floor, Ward C, was quiet that night. Quieter than usual. Most of the patients were sleeping. There were only a few active cases. A kid with a broken arm from a skateboarding accident. Another kid being treated for appendicitis. A teenager with an infected surgical wound. The usual kinds of cases that a pediatric hospital deals with. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that seemed to require much attention or intervention, and I settled into a comfortable boredom. The kind of boredom that I had come to appreciate about night shifts. The sense that the worst of the chaos had passed and that you could just sit quietly and wait for the morning to come. But around 1:40 in the morning, I started to feel a shift in the atmosphere. A sense that something had changed, though I could not quite articulate what it was. The air seemed heavier somehow. Or perhaps it was colder, and I remember noticing that my breath was becoming slightly visible, which should not have been happening in the spring, even at night. And then at 1:42, the call bell from room 312 rang out, and my entire body went completely rigid, because room 312 had been empty for 3 months. I was absolutely certain of this. I had personally inspected it, had verified that it was locked, had made note of its empty status in the official logs, so there could not possibly have been anyone in that room. And yet the bell was ringing persistently, a steady red light on the duty board showing that room 312 was requesting assistance. And my first thought was that the electrical system was malfunctioning, that there was some kind of short circuit or power surge or technical malfunction. But there was something in my stomach that twisted into a knot of pure dread, something in my deep consciousness that seemed to know the truth before my rational mind could grasp it. But I told myself I was being irrational. I told myself it was just a technical problem. I picked up the intercom and I said, "Room 312. This is Dr. Malhotra. What is the issue?" And what I heard in response was something that I will never forget. Something that still wakes me up at night in a cold sweat. What I heard was breathing, very soft and very close, as if someone had their mouth right up against the speaker, and the breathing had a wet quality to it. A sound like someone breathing through mucus or blood or water. And beneath the sound of breathing, I could hear something else. Something that might have been a voice, but that was too faint to make out. I said, "Hello? Is anyone there?" And the breathing continued, steady and slow and filled with an intention that I could somehow sense but not articulate. And then I heard it. The voice. soft and high-pitched, like a child's voice, but corrupted somehow, altered, as if being transmitted from very far away or from underwater. And it said just one word, help. And then the breathing continued, and I realized that I was holding my own breath, and my hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. And I said, I'm coming to room 312. And I hung up the intercom, and I grabbed my torch, which was an old-fashioned heavy one with a genuine bulb, not in lead, the kind of thing that seemed anachronistic in a modern hospital. But that was nonetheless what we used, and I walked out into the third-floor corridor, and the hallway was darker than it should have been, darker than it normally was, as if the emergency lights had been dimmed, or as if the darkness had become thicker, more physical, and I could feel it pressing against me as I walked, and I could see my breath forming in the air in front of my face, and the temperature was dropping. I could feel it in my extremities first, my fingers going numb even as I gripped the torch tightly, and I remember thinking that something was very wrong, that I should turn around and go back to the duty room and call security. But instead I found myself moving forward, moving toward room 312, drawn forward by something that I could not resist. And when I got to the door, it was slightly ajar, and I could see into the room, and I could see that there was a shape on the bed, a small shape, and the shape was moving slightly, as if the person lying in the bed was shifting, turning, struggling against something. And I pushed the door open fully, and I turned on the light, and what I saw made me want to run, made me want to scream. But instead, I just froze, completely unable to move or think or process what my eyes were reporting to my brain. The bed had unmistakably been slept in. The sheets were twisted and bunched up as if someone had been lying in them, thrashing, fighting, and there was still an impression in the mattress, still a visible indentation in the shape of a small body, small enough to be a child. And I reached out, shaking so badly that I could barely control my arm, and I touched that indentation, and it was warm, impossibly, inexplicably warm, warm with body heat, and the sheet itself was warm too, and it seemed to cling to my fingers as if it did not want to let go, as if it was reaching for me as much as I was reaching for it. And the call button on the pillow was pressed down, visibly indented, and the whole room smelled wrong. There was the normal hospital smell of disinfectant and stale air, but underneath that, there was another smell, a sweet rotten smell that made my stomach lurch and my eyes water, a smell like something organic that had been decomposing, a smell like death, like the smell you encounter in the basement of a hospital where they keep the bodies that are waiting for the morgue. And I realized that I was gasping for breath, that my lungs were constricting, that I was on the edge of a panic attack, and I stumbled backward out of the room, and I stood in the hallway with my hand over my mouth, trying not to vomit, and I heard the sound of the call bell ringing again, still from room 312, still persistent, still patient, still waiting for me to do something, to acknowledge it, to answer it. And I knew with absolute certainty that I was not going back in that room. I did not know how or why, but I knew that if I went back in there, I would not come back out. Not unchanged, at least. Something in there was waiting for me. Something hungry. Something that had been waiting for 7 years. And I walked back to the duty room as quickly as I could. And I sat down in the chair, and I picked up my phone with the intention of calling security, of reporting what I had seen, of explaining to someone in authority that there was an unauthorized person in a locked room and they needed to investigate. But before I could dial the number, the call bell from room 319 rang out at approximately 2:10 in the morning. Mr. Sharma in room 319 pressed his call bell. Sharma was 68 years old, a retired school teacher, admitted with congestive heart failure. His condition, when I had examined him earlier that evening, had been stable. His vitals were normal. His oxygen saturation was acceptable. He had been sleeping peacefully when I checked on him around midnight. So when his call bell rang, I assumed he needed something minor, pain medication or water or assistance with the bathroom. I went to his room, and I found him sitting up in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the corner of the room near his pillow, staring with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and he was trembling. Actually, trembling, his whole body shaking beneath the blankets. And when I came in, he turned to look at me, and his eyes were filled with a fear that I had rarely seen in a patient, a fear that seemed to go beyond any rational concern. And he said, "Doctor, there is something in this room. There is something standing right there at the head of my bed. Can you not see it? It is so cold. Primera caine. Feel it. It is looking at me. It has been looking at me for hours. I can feel its eyes on me. Please make it go away." And I looked in the corner he was pointing at, and I saw nothing, just empty space. Just the normal fixtures of a hospital room, but I could feel something, could sense that there was something there, something just outside the range of my normal perception, something that was aware of me. And I said, "There is nothing there, Mr. Sharma. It is probably just a hallucination brought on by your condition. I am going to give you something to help you relax." And I administered a sedative, and I checked his vitals, and everything was normal. There was nothing medically wrong with him, and yet the fear in his eyes did not diminish, and I had to use all of my professional restraint not to show him how terrified I myself was becoming, because I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified, and I was starting to have the sinking realization that something was very wrong, something beyond my understanding or ability to explain, something that was happening at that hospital, something that was centered in room 312, something that was spreading like a infection throughout the building. And by 3 in the morning, it was undeniable. By 3 a.m., the entire third floor had descended into a kind of controlled chaos. Patients were pressing their call buttons. The nurses were running from room to room trying to attend to everyone. The monitors were showing anomalies and irregularities. The atmosphere in the building had become heavy and oppressive, and I was walking from room to room, checking on patients, trying to understand what was happening, trying to find a rational explanation for the sense of dread and wrongness that seemed to permeate the entire floor. And what I found was that many of the patients were reporting the same thing. They had the sensation that there was something in their rooms, something that they could not see, but that they could sense, something that was cold and that was watching them. And several of them described feeling watched, described being unable to sleep, described feeling a presence. That was not explicitly threatening, but that was deeply unsettling. Unsettling. And then at 3:15, the television in room 307 switched itself on. I did not see who switched it on. Nobody was in that room, but the television was suddenly broadcasting. And the image on the screen was unusual. It was a kind of white static, interspersed with something else. A shape, an image, something that seemed to be trying to materialize out of the static. And I stood there, watching it. And the more I watched, the clearer it became. There was a figure in that static. A small figure, a child, a girl with long dark hair and pale skin. Her head bent forward, her face obscured by her hair, and she was just standing there, motionless, waiting. And I felt something twist in my stomach when I saw her. Some part of me recognized her. Some part of me that had been pushing her image away for 7 years suddenly could not look away, could not deny what I was seeing, could not pretend anymore that what happened 7 years ago had not happened, or that it had not been my fault. And the pager at my hip suddenly buzzed, and it said, "I see you. Emergency." And I ran. I ran down the hallway as fast as I could, and I did not realize until much later that I had been running away from room 312. Running away from that image on the television. Running away from the knowledge that was forcing its way into my consciousness, despite all of my resistance and denial and self-deception. When I got to the ICU, Nurse Mira was standing at the nursing station, and she was staring at the monitors, and her face was absolutely pale, drained of all color. And when she turned to look at me, there was a kind of hopelessness in her eyes, a look of someone who was witnessing something that violated every law of nature and science that she understood. And she said, "Doctor, all of the monitors are flatlined. All of them. But the patients are breathing. I don't understand what is happening. All of the monitors show no activity, but the patients are breathing. They are all breathing together in perfect synchronization. And they have been for the past 20 minutes. And I don't know how that is possible." And I looked at the monitors, and she was right. Every single cardiac monitor showed a flat line, no electrical activity in any of the hearts. Every single cardiac monitor showed a flat line, no electrical activity in any of the hearts. But when I looked at the patients, when I actually looked at them, I could see that they were breathing. Their chests were rising and falling, rising and falling, all of them moving at exactly the same rate, in perfect unison, as if they were all being controlled by a single entity, as if a single will was moving through all of them. And I checked their pulse, and there was no pulse. Their hearts were not beating, and yet they were breathing, and their eyes were open. All of them, every patient's eyes were wide open, and their eyes were white, completely white, rolled back so far that I could see nothing but the whites, and they were not moving. They were staring at nothing, staring into some void that existed in a different dimension of reality. And I backed away from the beds, and something very cold and very small touched my shoulder from behind. I felt it immediately. Felt the distinct pressure of small fingers pressing into my shoulder, pressing so hard that it burned, and I spun around, and there was nothing there, nothing visible at least. But the cold remained. The fingerprints remained. I could feel 5 distinct pressure points where small fingers were gripping my shoulder, gripping so tightly that I knew there would be marks. And I ran. I ran down the stairs. I ran to the ground floor. I ran to the main entrance. I tried the doors, and they were locked. They would not open. And outside, I could see the rain continuing to hammer down, and I could hear something behind me. I could hear bare feet on the floor, slap, 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 moving slowly toward me, getting closer, and I spun around, and I looked in the mirror that hung on the wall near the door, and I saw her. I saw Ananya standing right behind me, and this time I could see her fully, not just a glimpse or a suggestion, but her complete form. She was 7 years old, with long dark hair that reached the middle of her back, and she was wearing a light blue dress with white flowers on it, the same dress she had been wearing the night she died, and her skin was very pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark, so dark they looked almost black, and they were looking directly at me, and they held an infinite sadness and an infinite rage. And when I turned around, she was gone, but I could feel her breath on the back of my neck, cold breath that seemed to come from very far away, and a voice spoke into my ear. A child's voice, but corrupted, layered with echoes, as if it was being transmitted from multiple dimensions at once, multiple versions of reality speaking at once. And it said, "You were tired that night, weren't you, doctor? You didn't want to take care of me. You thought I was not important. You thought my life was not worth your attention. You left me alone in the dark, and I died scared and in pain. And I died calling for my mother. And nobody came." Then I felt her grab my wrist, and the grip was ice cold and impossibly strong for something so small. And she pulled, and I felt myself being dragged backward, felt my feet leaving the ground. And I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out, and I felt something else grab my other wrist, and something else grabbed my ankle. And the weight of her pulling me down was immense, was the weight of 7 years of suffering and rage and despair. And everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was sitting in the duty room chair, and it was 7:15 in the morning. and the duty station was quiet, and I was alone, and there was a pen in my right hand, and my hand was moving automatically across the surface of a chart, writing the same sentence over and over again, and I could not make my hand stop. I tried. I tried to make my hand stop moving, but it would not obey. It kept writing, kept repeating the same phrase. Room 312. Ananya, I am here. And it continued like that for pages and pages. And when Dr. Hamilton came into the duty room at 7:25, he found me sitting in that chair, covered in a cold sweat, my eyes open and staring at nothing, my hand continuing to write the same phrase over and over again. And he asked, "Dr. Malhotra, are you all right?" And I turned to look at him, and I smiled, and I heard my own voice saying, "Everything is fine now. Everything is fine. But please remember one thing. Never answer the call bell from room 312, because she is still waiting there, and she will not stop waiting. And if you answer that bell, you will belong to her the way I belong to her now." And then everything went dark again, and when I woke up, I was in the psychiatric ward. And that is where I am now, 7 years later, still working at St. Agnes Hospital, because I could not leave. Because every time I tried to leave, every time I drove away from the hospital, I found myself turning the car around and driving back, because the pull was too strong, because Ananya has claim over me now, and the call bell from room 312 still rings. It rings at 1:42 in the morning, always at the same time, and I answer it, and I listen to her voice, and I do what she asks, and I will keep doing this for the rest of my life. And I am telling you this, not because I expect you to believe me, but because I hope that if you are reading this, if you ever find yourself in a position where you are responsible for another person's care, and you are tired or distracted or burnt out, I hope you will remember my story, and I hope you will check that chart, and I hope you will read that file, and I hope you will not let yourself become the person I became, because the cost of that negligence does not end when the patient dies. The cost follows you forever, and it will destroy you, and it will own you, and it will never let you go. And room 3712 is still waiting, and the call bell is still ringing, and I am still here, and I will always be here.